What if I told you that the first president ran one of America's largest whiskey operations while suppressing a rebellion against whiskey taxes? That the third kept a woman enslaved while writing about liberty? That one president annexed a foreign nation through constitutional gymnastics his own party rejected, and another manufactured a war to seize half of Mexico? Every presidency contains a gap between the marble bust in the history books and the documented deals made in smoke-filled rooms. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's congressional records, testimony transcripts, and investigative journalism from 2 centuries of American power. Hit subscribe. This is the kind of history they don't teach. Get comfortable. Pour something warm. Settle in for the night. By the spring of 1791, George Washington faced a problem that would define his presidency in ways that textbooks rarely mention. The man who led a revolution, partly over taxation, had just signed the Whiskey Act, placing the young republic's first federal tax on distilled spirits. What the official histories tend to skip is that Washington himself operated one of the largest whiskey distilleries in Virginia, producing 11,000 gallons annually at Mount Vernon by 1799. The president's private wealth depended on the same industry he was now taxing to fund Alexander Hamilton's financial system. When Pennsylvania farmers organized protests against the levy, Washington didn't see fellow citizens exercising their rights. He saw a threat to federal authority and, perhaps less discussed, a threat to his own commercial interests. The Whiskey Rebellion escalated through 1794, with protesters tarring and feathering tax collectors and threatening armed resistance. Washington's response was unprecedented. In October of that year, he personally led a federalized militia force of nearly 13,000 troops, larger than most Revolutionary War deployments, into western Pennsylvania. It was the only time a sitting president commanded troops in the field. The official narrative frames this as decisive leadership, the young government proving its capacity to enforce the law. What's documented but less celebrated is the economic calculation underlying that decision. Washington didn't just suppress a rebellion. He established through military force that the federal government could tax commerce, even commerce that directly enriched the president himself. By November, the rebellion collapsed without significant battle. Washington pardoned the leaders, returned to Philadelphia, and continued operating his distillery. The contradiction never appeared in his farewell address. The whiskey flowed. The taxes were paid. The precedent was set. Less discussed than Washington's business entanglements is the machinery he built for recovering his human property. Throughout his presidency, Washington placed advertisements in Pennsylvania newspapers, offering rewards for the return of enslaved people who had escaped from Mount Vernon. One of the most documented cases involved Ona Judge, a young woman enslaved by Martha Washington who fled to New Hampshire in 1796. Washington used his presidential resources and network to pursue her across state lines, even attempting to have her seized under the Fugitive Slave Act he had signed. Judge evaded capture and later gave interviews describing her escape and Washington's pursuit. The founding father, who spoke of liberty, maintained his wealth through a system of bondage he actively defended, even from the presidential mansion. The marble monument omits the advertisements. The testimonies remain in the archives. The contradiction defined more than Washington alone. It defined the compromise that made the presidency possible. John Adams entered office in 1797, carrying the weight of revolution and the burden of following Washington. His presidency would be remembered for many things, but the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 remain the clearest example of early American authoritarianism cloaked in national security language. Passed during tensions with France, the acts gave the federal government sweeping powers to deport foreign nationals and criminalize criticism of the government. The Sedition Act in particular made it illegal to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the president or Congress. It's the kind of law that sounds like something from a distant authoritarian regime, not the second American presidency. Adams didn't write the legislation himself, but he enforced it with enthusiasm. Over the next 2 years, his administration prosecuted at least 25 individuals, most of them Republican newspaper editors who had criticized Federalist policies. The documented cases reveal the machinery of political suppression dressed in legal procedure. Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont, was convicted under the Sedition Act for publishing criticism of Adams's unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp and sentenced to 4 months in prison plus a $1,000 fine. James Callender, a journalist, received 9 months and a $200 fine for writing that Adams was a repulsive pedant with a continual grasp for power. The prosecutions weren't random. They systematically targeted Adams's political opponents, particularly those supporting Thomas Jefferson's emerging Republican coalition. The trials took place in federal courts with Federalist judges presiding. Convictions were nearly automatic. By the time Jefferson won the 1800 election, Adams had successfully weaponized federal law against press criticism. Jefferson would later pardon those convicted, and Congress would eventually repay the fines. But the precedent lingered. A president had jailed journalists for criticizing him, and the Constitution hadn't stopped it. Adams left office in March 1801, declining to attend Jefferson's inauguration. The pardons came later that year. The Sedition Act expired on schedule. But the machinery Adams demonstrated, using law to silence opposition, would reappear throughout American history. Refined and renamed, never quite extinct. Thomas Jefferson took the oath of office in March 1801, preaching limited federal power and strict constitutional interpretation. His presidency would reveal the same gap between principle and practice that characterized his entire public life. The most personally damaging contradiction involved Sally Hemings, a woman he kept enslaved at Monticello. While the relationship remained unconfirmed during Jefferson's lifetime, DNA evidence and historical research have since documented that Jefferson almost certainly fathered at least 6 children with Hemings, beginning when she was approximately 16 and he was 44. The power imbalance made consent impossible. Jefferson wrote about human equality and natural rights while maintaining this relationship across decades. He never freed Hemings during his lifetime, though he did free several of their children in his will. The contradiction between his public philosophy and his private conduct represents more than personal hypocrisy. It exposes how American democracy was built on a foundation that excluded the majority of people living under its laws. Jefferson's political contradictions matched his personal ones. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the United States and is taught as one of history's great real estate deals. What's less emphasized is that Jefferson had spent years arguing for strict constitutional interpretation, insisting the federal government possessed only explicitly enumerated powers. The Constitution said nothing about acquiring foreign territory. Jefferson knew this. He initially proposed a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase, then abandoned the idea when he realized it would take too long. Instead, he simply executed the deal with France, spending $15 million of federal money on land acquisition the Constitution didn't authorize. It was expedient. It was transformative. It was also the exact kind of broad federal power Jefferson had condemned when his political opponents wielded it. His Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, raised concerns about the constitutional problem. Jefferson proceeded anyway. By July 1803, the deal was signed. By December, Congress had ratified it. The constitutional objection disappeared into the celebration of expansion. Jefferson's philosophy bent to accommodate Jefferson's ambition, and the land became American. The principle returned whenever convenient, dormant but available for future use. James Madison inherited the presidency in 1809, and with it inherited the tensions with Britain that would explode into the War of 1812. What often escapes notice in the patriotic narrative is how that war served financial interests beyond simple national defense. Madison and his allies had deep connections to land speculation schemes that required British withdrawal from the Northwest Territory and Spanish weakness in Florida. The war wasn't just about impressment of sailors or British arrogance. It was also about opening Western lands for settlement and speculation, enriching the very political class that voted for the conflict. Madison himself held interests in land companies that would benefit from territorial expansion. When the war began in June 1812, it was sold as defending national honor. The business calculations stayed private. The war went poorly. By August 1814, British forces had marched into Washington and burned the Capitol, the White House, and most government buildings. Madison and his cabinet fled the city. The president spent the night of August 24th in a Virginia farmhouse while the Capitol burned. The official history frames this as temporary setback before American resilience prevailed. The documented reality is messier. The burning of Washington was a humiliation that exposed catastrophic unpreparedness. Madison's administration had gone to war without adequate military funding, training, or strategy. The coastal cities were vulnerable. The capital was indefensible. The Warhawks had promised easy victory and quick territorial gains. Instead, the nation's capital was ash, and the president was in hiding. Peace negotiations were already underway when Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, but before news reached Louisiana. The victory salvaged American pride and Jackson's career. It didn't change the treaty terms. Madison returned to a rebuilt Washington. His reputation survived, and the land speculation continued. The war's financial beneficiaries rarely appeared in the victory celebrations, but they appeared in the land office records. The precedent was established. You could start a war for unstated reasons, lose the capital, and still declare victory if the final battle went well. The machinery of power adapted. The marble continued to hide the smoke. James Monroe entered the presidency in 1817, during what historians would label the era of good feelings, a name that speaks more to the temporary absence of organized political opposition than to any genuine national contentment. Monroe would oversee the Missouri Compromise of 1820, one of the early republic's most cynical backroom arrangements. The official story presents it as statesmanship preventing disunion. The documented reality shows a carefully choreographed deal where Northern politicians traded away the principle of restricting slavery's expansion in exchange for maintaining sectional balance in the Senate. Monroe didn't author the compromise. That credit goes to Henry Clay and others. But the president managed the politics quietly, ensuring the arrangement held. The deal admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the sectional balance at 12 states each, while drawing a line at the 3630 parallel prohibiting slavery in territories north of it. It sounded principled. The principle was abandonment. Northern congressmen who had opposed slavery's expansion voted for the compromise because their constituents wanted sectional peace more than they wanted justice. Southern politicians accepted a temporary limit on expansion because they understood the line could be redrawn later. Monroe signed the legislation in March 1820. The compromise held for 30 years, then collapsed into civil war, but for Monroe's presidency, it served its purpose. The Union survived. The politics stabilized. The enslaved population in Missouri remained enslaved. Everyone in power got what they needed. Monroe's second major territorial achievement was acquiring Florida from Spain through the Adams-Ons Treaty of 1819. The official version emphasizes diplomatic skill. The fuller story includes General Andrew Jackson's unauthorized invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818, where he executed 2 British citizens and seized Spanish forts, creating an international incident that somehow resolved in America's favor. Jackson claimed he had secret authorization from Monroe. Monroe denied it. The documentation remains ambiguous, which is often the point. What's clear is that Jackson's aggression put Spain in a position where ceding Florida looked like the dignified option compared to continued military humiliation. Monroe disavowed Jackson publicly while using the crisis to pressure Spain. By February 1819, Spain agreed to cede Florida and settle boundary disputes in exchange for American assumption of up to $5 million in claims by U.S. citizens against Spain. It was conquest through plausible deniability. Jackson became a national hero. Monroe got Florida. Spain got out. The two British citizens Jackson executed never got a trial. The method became template. Let a general create the crisis, disavow him if necessary, accept the territorial gains. Monroe left office in 1825, with the nation larger, more prosperous, and no more democratic than he found it. The compromises just had better branding. John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State and son of the second president, entered the presidency in 1825 under clouds of what became known as the corrupt bargain. The election of 1824 produced no electoral college majority, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but not a majority. The House had to choose among the top three candidates: Jackson, Adams, and William Crawford. Henry Clay, who finished fourth and was thus eliminated, controlled significant congressional influence as Speaker of the House. Clay despised Jackson and used his influence to deliver the presidency to Adams. Days after Adams's House victory in February 1825, he nominated Clay as Secretary of State, the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. The sequence was too convenient. Jackson and his supporters immediately cried corruption, arguing that Adams and Clay had made a deal. Clay's support in exchange for the office that would position him for a future presidency. Adams and Clay denied it. The documentation proves neither guilt nor innocence definitively, which is why it remains historically contested. What's documented is the sequence, the nomination, and the political benefit each man received. What's also documented is that this controversy destroyed Adams's ability to govern effectively. His presidency was hamstrung from the start. Every policy initiative faced accusations of illegitimacy. Jackson spent 4 years building a political coalition based partly on the corrupt bargain narrative. Adams's ambitious domestic program, federal infrastructure, a national university, scientific expeditions, died in Congress. He proposed neutrality in South American independence struggles while maintaining diplomatic protocols that looked like aristocratic pretension to a democratizing electorate. Adams was a brilliant diplomat and a principled statesman who entered the presidency through a process that looked corrupt regardless of the reality. The perception destroyed him. Jackson won a landslide in 1828. Adams left Washington without attending Jackson's inauguration, repeating his father's bitter exit. Clay remained Secretary of State until the end. The corrupt bargain became Democratic folklore, proof that elites made deals in back rooms while claiming to represent the people. Whether the specific deal happened mattered less than how perfectly it illustrated what voters had come to believe about their government. Andrew Jackson's presidency from 1829 to 1837 represented the revenge of the outsider and the triumph of what his supporters called democracy. What it actually represented was a reconfiguration of American power that replaced one elite with another, while deploying populist rhetoric to obscure the replacement. Jackson's defining policy was Indian removal, culminating in the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave Jackson authority to negotiate treaties exchanging Native American tribal lands in the Southeast for territory west of the Mississippi. The law required voluntary agreement. Jackson treated it as authorization for forced deportation. The Cherokee Nation challenged removal in the Supreme Court and won. In Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee territory. Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether Jackson said exactly those words is disputed, but what's documented is that he ignored the ruling and proceeded with removal anyway. Between 1831 and 1839, approximately 15,000 Cherokee were forced to march to Oklahoma Territory. Around 4,000 died from exposure, disease, and starvation during the journey. The logistics were documented in military records. The suffering was witnessed and recorded. Jackson's policy was genocide dressed in legislation, and the Supreme Court couldn't stop it. Jackson's other defining battle was destroying the Second Bank of the United States, which he viewed as a corrupt monopoly serving Eastern elites. He was partly right. The bank concentrated financial power in ways that benefited its directors and their allies. But Jackson's alternative wasn't democratic finance. It was patronage and chaos. After vetoing the bank's recharter in 1832 and winning re-election partly on that veto, Jackson withdrew federal deposits from the bank in 1833 and distributed them among state banks run by political allies, nicknamed pet banks. The result was speculative chaos and eventually the Panic of 1837, though that crisis hit after Jackson left office. What's less discussed is that Jackson's attack on the bank enriched his political allies who ran the pet banks. It was presented as war against elite corruption. It was actually elite replacement, trading one network of financial power for another while deploying populist language. Jackson left office in March 1837, handing power to his chosen successor Martin Van Buren, just as the economic consequences of his banking policies materialized. The Panic of 1837 destroyed banks, businesses, and savings across the nation. Jackson retired to Tennessee, his reputation secure among his base. Van Buren inherited the crisis. The pattern held. Jackson made the decisions. Someone else absorbed the consequences. Martin Van Buren became president in March 1837 and inherited an economy collapsing from speculation and Jackson's banking chaos. The Panic of 1837 began within months of his inauguration. Van Buren's response was to do essentially nothing, arguing that government intervention would make things worse. It was a principled position that resulted in widespread suffering. What's less noted is that Van Buren had been Jackson's vice president and primary political advisor. He knew the banking decisions that helped cause the crisis. He had supported them. As the economy collapsed, Van Buren maintained that the crisis would self-correct through market mechanisms. Banks failed. Unemployment spread. Prices dropped. The Depression lasted through his presidency. Van Buren lost re-election in 1840 in a landslide. It's the kind of political karma that looks like justice until you remember that the people who suffered the Depression weren't the ones who caused it. Van Buren left office, practiced law, and eventually returned to politics. The depositors who lost their savings in failed pet banks had fewer options. Van Buren's deeper legacy was perfecting the political machine that Jackson had built. The Albany Regency in New York, which Van Buren organized before his presidency, became the model for party politics as organized patronage. The machine distributed government jobs based on loyalty, not competence. It treated political office as spoils to be divided among supporters. It's the system we call corruption when other countries do it. In America, Van Buren helped normalize it as democratic politics. He called it rotation in office, arguing that ordinary citizens deserved a chance at government employment. In practice, it meant government jobs went to party loyalists who funded campaigns and delivered votes. The system survived Van Buren. It evolved through the 19th century into progressively more sophisticated forms. By the time civil service reform arrived in the 1880s, the spoils system had been normal for half a century. Van Buren didn't invent patronage, but he systematized it, packaged it as democratic reform, and left it embedded in American governance. The machinery ran on loyalty and reward. The efficiency was optional. The corruption was structural. The model endures, renamed and refined but fundamentally unchanged. William Henry Harrison served as president for 31 days in 1841 before dying of pneumonia, making him the shortest tenured president in American history. The irony that escapes most retrospectives is that Harrison died before he could generate the scandals his career suggested were coming. His inauguration on March 4th was held in cold rain. Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours, without a coat or hat, reportedly to demonstrate his vigor at age 68. He caught pneumonia within days and died on April 4th. The official narrative treats this as tragedy. The cynical read is that America lost a president but gained a cautionary tale. What gets less attention is what Harrison represented politically. He was elected as the Whig alternative to Van Buren's Democrats, running a campaign that deployed populist imagery while hiding that Harrison came from Virginia plantation aristocracy. The log cabin and hard cider campaign of 1840 was manufactured folksy authenticity, selling a wealthy man as a common frontier hero. It worked spectacularly. Harrison won in a landslide. Then he died before implementing any policies. History remembers the inaugural address and the pneumonia. It forgets that Harrison's political career included serving as governor of Indiana Territory, where he negotiated treaties that dispossessed Native American tribes of millions of acres, often through alcohol, debt, and coercion. Harrison got elected by pretending to be something he wasn't, then died before the pretense required actual governance. In the catalog of presidential scandals, Harrison's is absence. What he might have done remained theoretical. The log cabin stayed a symbol. The treaties stayed in force. The image outlasted the man by design. John Tyler inherited the presidency when Harrison died, and immediately generated constitutional controversy that overshadowed everything else. No president had died in office before. The Constitution stated that in such cases, the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the office, but it didn't explicitly state whether the vice president became president or merely acting president. Tyler insisted he was president, period. He took the oath, moved into the White House, and refused to acknowledge documents addressed to acting President Tyler. Congress initially resisted. Tyler didn't care. He established through sheer insistence the precedent that the vice president becomes president upon the president's death, not merely a caretaker. It was constitutional interpretation through stubbornness, and it stuck. What Tyler did with that power is where things get interesting. His major achievement was annexing Texas in 1845 through a joint resolution of Congress, bypassing the 2/3 Senate majority required for a treaty. Texas had been an independent republic since 1836, having broken away from Mexico partly to preserve slavery, which Mexico had abolished. Annexation was controversial because it would add a large slave state and likely provoke war with Mexico. Tyler negotiated an annexation treaty in 1844. The Senate rejected it. So Tyler used his final months in office to pursue annexation through a joint resolution, which required only simple majorities in both houses. It was a constitutional workaround to achieve what the treaty process had rejected. The resolution passed both houses in late February 1845, days before Tyler left office. Tyler signed it on March 1st, 3 days before James K. Polk's inauguration. Tyler then left office having accomplished what no previous president had managed: annexing a foreign republic over Senate opposition by finding a procedural loophole. The consequences were exactly what opponents had predicted. Mexico broke diplomatic relations immediately. War followed within a year. Texas entered the Union as a slave state, tilting the sectional balance and accelerating the path to civil war. Tyler's method became precedent. If you couldn't get a treaty through the Senate, you could try a joint resolution instead. Constitutional process was negotiable. The goal was expansion. The Constitution was flexible. Tyler left office in March 1845. technically a president without a party since the Whigs had expelled him for vetoing their legislation. He retired to Virginia and eventually joined the Confederacy during the Civil War, serving briefly in the Confederate Congress before his death in 1862. The annexation of Texas remained his legacy. The war it caused would define the next 2 decades. James K. Polk entered office in March 1845 determined to expand American territory, and he succeeded dramatically through a combination of diplomacy and manufactured war. His administration acquired more territory than any presidency except Jefferson's. The Oregon Territory was settled through negotiation with Britain in 1846, establishing the 49th parallel as the border. That was the diplomatic part. The conquest of Mexican territory was less diplomatic. Polk wanted California and the Southwest. Mexico wouldn't sell, so Polk created conditions for war. In January 1846, he ordered General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, land Mexico considered Mexican territory. It was a deliberate provocation. When Mexican forces attacked Taylor's troops in April, Polk had his pretext. He asked Congress for a declaration of war in May 1846, claiming Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil. It was technically true only if you accepted Polk's definition of American soil, which required ignoring that the territory was disputed and U.S. forces had been ordered there precisely to create conflict. The war lasted until February 1848 and ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which forced Mexico to cede California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, about half of Mexico's territory, in exchange for $15 million. It's taught as manifest destiny fulfilled. It was conquest through manufactured justification. The Nooses Strip deployment was deliberate strategy to create a casus belli. Congressman Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk in the House, demanding to know the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil, arguing that Polk had provoked the war unconstitutionally. Polk ignored him. The war continued. The territory was seized. $15 million was paid, which made it look like a purchase rather than conquest, which was precisely the point. Polk achieved his territorial goals and declined to run for re-election in 1848, leaving office in March 1849. He died 3 months later at age 53, exhausted by the presidency. The conquered territory entered the Union. The slavery question exploded over how to organize it. The Civil War's origins trace partly to the land Polk seized. The spot where American blood was shed remained disputed, which was Abraham Lincoln's point. Polk manufactured a war, conquered half a neighbor's territory, and called it destiny. The textbooks mostly agreed. Zachary Taylor, the general who commanded the troops in Polk's manufactured war, became president in March 1849 and died 16 months later in July 1850. Supposedly from cholera morbus after consuming cold milk and cherries at a 4th of July celebration. The official cause of death was accepted for over a century. In 1991, Taylor's body was exhumed to test for arsenic poisoning, following speculation that he'd been murdered for his opposition to expanding slavery into territories acquired from Mexico. The tests found no evidence of poisoning. The cholera diagnosis stood. But the fact that Taylor's death required exhumation and testing 140 years later speaks to how convenient his death was politically. Taylor, a Louisiana slaveholder, had nevertheless opposed extending slavery into the Mexican territories, believing it would tear the Union apart. His position infuriated Southern radicals. He died just as Congress was finalizing the Compromise of 1850, which would have faced presidential resistance. Taylor's death allowed Millard Fillmore, his vice president and a compromise supporter, to assume office and sign the legislation. Whether Taylor was murdered remains unproven. What's documented is that his death was politically convenient for forces he opposed. and that convenience generated enough suspicion to justify exhumation a century later. Taylor's brief presidency is mostly forgotten, overshadowed by his death and the compromise that followed it. What's worth noting is that Taylor represented the Whig Party's last gasp at national relevance. The party was collapsing under the weight of the slavery question. Taylor's death accelerated that collapse. Within 6 years, the Whigs would cease to exist as a national party, replaced by the Republicans. Taylor died before the implications became clear, which is a pattern in this chronology. Presidents who served long enough to create scandals, and presidents who died conveniently before their positions required defense. Harrison died before governing. Taylor died before his opposition to the Compromise of 1850 required confrontation with Congress and his own party. The presidency preserved their reputations through timely mortality. The machine continued. The slavery question festered. The compromises delayed but couldn't prevent the reckoning that was coming. Taylor's body went into the ground in 1850 with military honors. It came out in 1991 with test results showing cholera, not arsenic. The question of whether his death was too convenient remained unanswered. The arsenic wasn't there. The suspicion was. The presidency moved forward. The machinery adapted. Millard Fillmore assumed the presidency in July 1850 following Taylor's death and immediately faced the sectional crisis Taylor had tried to resist. Fillmore's signature act was signing the Compromise of 1850, a package of 5 bills that temporarily diffused tensions over slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico. The Compromise admitted California as a free state, organized New Mexico and Utah territories with no restrictions on slavery, settled the Texas-New Mexico boundary dispute, abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and, most consequentially, enacted a new Fugitive Slave Act. That final provision is where Fillmore's complicity becomes undeniable. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required federal officials and Northern citizens to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves. It denied alleged fugitives the right to trial by jury and prohibited them from testifying on their own behalf. It created federal commissioners who received $10 if they ruled someone was a fugitive slave, but only $5 if they ruled in favor of freedom, a built-in financial incentive for enslavement. The law essentially nationalized slavery, forcing free states to participate in its enforcement. Fillmore didn't just sign this legislation. He enforced it vigorously, sending federal troops and marshals to northern cities to capture people who had escaped slavery, sometimes decades earlier. In Boston in 1851, federal forces arrested Thomas Sims, a man who had escaped from Georgia, and returned him to slavery despite massive public protests. In Syracuse, a fugitive named Jerry Henry was rescued from federal custody by abolitionists, and what became known as the Jerry Rescue. Fillmore ordered prosecutions of the rescuers. The president treated resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act as rebellion against federal authority, which technically it was, but that framing erased the moral content of what was being enforced. Fillmore was deploying federal power to return human beings to bondage. He did so in the name of preserving the Union and honoring constitutional obligations. The Union was preserved temporarily. The compromises made it more fragile, not stronger. Every fugitive captured and returned under Fillmore's enforcement radicalized more Northerners against the slave system. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin partly in response to the Fugitive Slave Act's enforcement. The law Fillmore championed helped create the anti-slavery movement that would eventually destroy the compromise he defended. Fillmore's presidency also demonstrated the pattern of Northern politicians sacrificing principle to maintain political viability in a system that gave the South disproportionate power. Fillmore was from New York, a free state. He built his career in Whig Party politics. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act, knowing it was morally indefensible, because he believed preserving the Union required appeasing the South. It's the calculus that would define Northern Democratic and moderate Whig positions for the next decade. Sacrifice black freedom to prevent Southern secession. The calculation failed. The South seceded anyway. The people who were returned to slavery under Fillmore's enforcement remained enslaved. Fillmore left office in March 1853, his party collapsing and his reputation declining. He ran for president again in 1856 as the Know Nothing Party candidate, a nativist organization that blamed immigrants for America's problems, finishing third. He died in 1874. The Fugitive Slave Act was repealed in 1864 after the Civil War had made it moot. The people it had condemned to continued bondage didn't get reparations. They got a war that freed them while killing hundreds of thousands. Fillmore's compromise failed on every level except temporarily postponing the inevitable. Franklin Pierce entered the presidency in March 1853 and spent 4 years demonstrating that weak leadership in a crisis is its own form of corruption. Pierce was a Northern Democrat who believed appeasing the South would preserve the Union. His signature legislative achievement was supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which overturned the Missouri Compromise's prohibition on slavery north of the 3630 line, and instead allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide the slavery question. Through popular sovereignty, the architect was Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, but Pierce provided critical presidential support. The bill passed in May 1854. The result was immediate violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, both sides determined to control the territorial government and thus the slavery decision. By 1855, the territory had descended into guerrilla warfare that newspapers called Bleeding Kansas. Armed bands attacked settlements. The town of Lawrence was sacked by pro-slavery forces in May 1856. Abolitionist John Brown led a retaliatory massacre at Pottawatomie Creek, killing 5 pro-slavery settlers. Over the next several years, approximately 56 people died in the Kansas violence. Pierce responded by siding with pro-slavery territorial governments that had been elected through fraud and violence, recognizing their legitimacy even as evidence of electoral manipulation became undeniable. The Lecompton Constitution, drafted by a pro-slavery convention in 1857 after Pierce left office, illustrated the corruption he had enabled. The convention refused to allow a fair vote on whether Kansas would be slave or free, instead offering voters a choice between the Constitution with slavery or the Constitution with no new slaves, but existing slaves and their descendants would remain enslaved. It was a rigged referendum. The Free State majority boycotted it. The pro-slavery Constitution passed and was sent to Congress for approval. Pierce's successor, James Buchanan, supported it. Congress eventually rejected it after evidence of fraud became overwhelming. But Pierce had created the conditions for this charade by treating clearly illegitimate territorial governments as legitimate because they supported slavery. It's corruption through willful blindness, knowing the process was fraudulent and endorsing it anyway, because the alternative was confronting the South. Pierce left office in March 1857, with Kansas still bleeding and his own party declining to renominate him. He's remembered as one of the worst presidents, which understates the specific damage he caused. Pierce took an already unstable situation and made it violently worse by backing a policy he knew would lead to conflict, then siding with pro-slavery forces even when their tactics included electoral fraud and terrorism. The Kansas violence radicalized both sides and made peaceful resolution less likely. Pierce returned to New Hampshire after leaving office and spent his remaining years defending the Confederacy during the Civil War, even as his home state sent troops to fight it. He died in 1869, largely forgotten except as an example of how not to lead during crisis. The Kansas Territory eventually entered the Union as a free state in 1861, after the South had seceded and couldn't block it. The 56 people who died in Bleeding Kansas didn't die for popular sovereignty. They died because Pierce enabled violence by pretending fraud was democracy. James Buchanan became president in March 1857 and spent 4 years watching the country slide towards civil war while doing essentially nothing to stop it. Buchanan's presidency is often taught as passive failure, a weak man unable to act decisively. The documented reality is more damning. Buchanan actively aided the South while claiming neutrality. Just 2 days after his inauguration, the Supreme Court announced its decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, ruling that black people could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in federal territories. What's less discussed is that Buchanan had advanced knowledge of the decision and publicly stated in his inaugural address that the slavery question would soon be settled by the Supreme Court, whose decision all Americans should accept. Buchanan had been in communication with Justice Robert Grier, his fellow Pennsylvanian, lobbying for the court to issue a broad pro-slavery ruling rather than deciding the case on narrow grounds. Grier kept Buchanan informed of the court's deliberations. It was improper coordination between the executive and judicial branches to produce a predetermined outcome favorable to slavery. The Dred Scott decision didn't settle the slavery question. It radicalized opposition and made compromise impossible by declaring that slavery couldn't be legally restricted. Buchanan spent the rest of his presidency insisting that Southern secession would be illegal, but that the federal government had no constitutional power to prevent it. A position that satisfied no one and paralyzed federal response. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, Buchanan condemned it but did nothing. When Southern states began seizing federal forts and arsenals, Buchanan protested but didn't act. By the time he left office in March 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederacy, and Buchanan had spent months insisting his hands were tied. It was constitutional theorizing as a substitute for leadership. Lincoln inherited a country already split and a military hollowed out by Southern officers who had resigned to join the Confederacy. Buchanan returned to Pennsylvania and spent the Civil War years defending his inaction, arguing he had prevented war by not resisting secession. The argument required ignoring that his passivity enabled the South to organize and arm while the federal government did nothing. Buchanan's failure was compounded by corruption within his administration. Several cabinet members were Southern sympathizers who actively worked to weaken federal authority. His Secretary of War, John Floyd of Virginia, transferred weapons from Northern to Southern arsenals in the months before secession, ensuring that when Southern states seized those arsenals, they captured well-stocked facilities. Floyd resigned in December 1860 and later joined the Confederate Army. Buchanan knew Floyd's sympathies, but didn't remove him until after the damage was done. It's the kind of administrative corruption that operates through deliberate inattention, the president knowing his subordinates are undermining federal authority and doing nothing, because confrontation would be uncomfortable. Buchanan died in 1868, his reputation destroyed. The Civil War he claimed to have prevented through inaction killed over 600,000 people. The weapons Floyd transferred to Southern arsenals were used against Union troops. The Supreme Court decision Buchanan helped engineer was eventually overturned by constitutional amendments that Buchanan opposed. His presidency represents the institutional collapse that made war inevitable. Not through dramatic failure, but through steady erosion of authority and principle, until nothing remained but the choice between surrender or violence. Abraham Lincoln entered the presidency in March 1861 and is remembered as the president who saved the Union and freed the slaves. Both things are true. What's also true is that Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, jailed critics without trial, suppressed newspapers, and oversaw massive war profiteering that enriched contractors while soldiers died with defective equipment. The suspension of habeas corpus began in April 1861 in Maryland, where Confederate sympathizers threatened Washington's supply lines. Lincoln authorized military arrests of suspected Confederate supporters without charging them or granting them trials. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled the suspension unconstitutional and ex parte Merryman, arguing only Congress could suspend habeas corpus. Lincoln ignored the ruling. By September 1862, he had expanded the suspension nationwide for anyone accused of discouraging enlistment or providing aid to the rebellion. Estimates suggest over 13,000 civilians were arrested and detained without trial during the war. Some were Confederate spies. Others were newspaper editors who criticized the war, state legislators who opposed federal policy, and citizens accused by neighbors with personal grudges. The process for determining who deserved arrest was arbitrary. The military controlled detention. Civilian courts had no jurisdiction. Lincoln defended the suspensions as military necessity. The argument was that you can't preserve constitutional government if the country ceases to exist, so temporary suspension of rights was justified to save the system. It's the authoritarian logic that appears in every crisis. Rights are suspended to preserve the system that guarantees those rights, and the suspension outlasts the immediate emergency. Lincoln's suspensions continued until the war's end. They were never formally lifted so much as they became unnecessary when the Confederacy surrendered. The 13,000 detained without trial never received apologies or compensation. The precedent remained. Future presidents would cite Lincoln's example when seeking emergency powers. The machinery of extralegal detention had been tested and proven effective. It remained available for future crises. Less discussed than the civil liberties suspensions is the systematic war profiteering that occurred under Lincoln's administration. The War Department in 1861 and 1862 was chaotic, awarding contracts to suppliers who delivered defective rifles, spoiled food, and diseased horses at inflated prices. The shoddy scandal involved uniforms made from reprocessed wool that disintegrated in rain, leaving soldiers exposed. Congressional investigations documented systematic fraud, but prosecutions were rare. The suppliers had political connections. The contracts kept flowing. Secretary of War Simon Cameron was forced to resign in January 1862 amid corruption allegations, replaced by Edwin Stanton, who brought more competence, but couldn't eliminate the profiteering entirely. The system was too decentralized and the demand too urgent. By 1864, the War Department had improved contracting procedures, but by then, fortunes had been made selling the government defective supplies. Lincoln wasn't personally corrupt, but his administration oversaw a system where contractors profited from wartime emergency while soldiers carried rifles that misfired. The memorial on the National Mall omits this complexity. The congressional investigations documented it extensively. Both things can be true. Lincoln saved the Union and ended slavery, and his administration enabled corruption that cost lives and rewarded fraud. The marble hides the smoke. The records remain in the archives. The contradiction defines more than Lincoln alone. Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency in April 1865 after Lincoln's assassination and spent 4 years proving that following a martyr is impossible and that personal racism can override political survival instincts. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who remained loyal to the Union during the war. Lincoln chose him as running mate in 1864 to signal national unity. That calculation failed to account for what Johnson would do with presidential power. His approach to Reconstruction was to oppose nearly every measure designed to protect formerly enslaved people and to support the rapid restoration of Southern state governments led by former Confederate officials. By December 1865, Johnson had issued thousands of pardons to Confederate leaders, allowing them to reclaim property and political rights. The state governments organized under his authority passed black codes, laws restricting the freedom of black citizens through vagrancy statutes, labor contracts, and restrictions on property ownership and legal rights. The black codes were slavery by other means. Johnson defended them as appropriate state regulation. Congress, controlled by Republicans, responded by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared all persons born in the United States to be citizens with equal protection under law, directly overriding the Dred Scott decision and the Black Codes. Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto in April 1866. Congress then passed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection. Johnson opposed it and encouraged Southern states to reject ratification, which 10 of 11 former Confederate states did initially. Johnson's obstruction convinced congressional Republicans that he was actively trying to undo the war's outcome. The conflict escalated through 1867 as Congress passed Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's vetoes, placing the South under military authority and requiring new state constitutions guaranteeing black voting rights. Johnson enforced these laws minimally, using his power as commander-in-chief to appoint military governors sympathetic to white Southern interests and to issue pardons undermining military authority. The breaking point came when Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by removing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without Senate approval in February 1868. The act, passed in 1867, required Senate consent to remove officials whose appointments had required Senate confirmation. It was partly designed to protect Stanton, who was implementing congressional reconstruction over Johnson's objections. Johnson considered the act unconstitutional and removed Stanton anyway. The House impeached Johnson in February 1868 on 11 articles, primarily focused on the Stanton removal, but also alleging Johnson had brought the presidency into contempt through his public statements attacking Congress. The Senate trial lasted from March to May. Johnson avoided conviction by one vote. The final tally was 35 guilty to 19 not guilty, one vote short of the 2/3 majority required for removal. What's often missed in the dramatic near-miss narrative is the corruption beneath the procedural fight. Johnson's opposition to Reconstruction wasn't just principled constitutional disagreement. He was personally racist, regularly referring to black Americans in derogatory terms, even in official contexts. His pardons of Confederate leaders weren't just about reconciliation. They restored property and power to the same class that had started the war, many of whom were personal and political allies. There were also allegations, never fully proven but documented in congressional testimony, that Johnson's administration sold pardons to wealthy Confederates. The investigation suggested that agents acting on behalf of the administration offered pardons in exchange for payment, with the money reportedly going to Johnson's political supporters and possibly to Johnson himself. The evidence was circumstantial. Investigators documented meetings between pardon seekers and Johnson's allies, followed by pardons being issued and money changing hands. Johnson denied involvement. The proof was never definitive enough to support criminal charges, but the pattern was suspicious enough that it became one of the impeachment articles. Though not the primary focus, Johnson survived impeachment and left office in March 1869, with his reputation destroyed among Republicans, but intact among white Southerners who appreciated his obstruction of Reconstruction. He returned to Tennessee and eventually won election to the Senate in 1875, the only former president to do so, serving until his death a few months later. His brief Senate tenure was spent denouncing Reconstruction and federal authority. The pardon-selling allegations remained unresolved. The black codes he defended eventually evolved into Jim Crow laws that lasted another century. Johnson's legacy is straightforward. He used presidential power to undermine the outcome of the Civil War and to prevent formerly enslaved people from achieving meaningful freedom. The impeachment failed by one vote. The corruption beneath it was never fully investigated. The pattern held: constitutional procedure without accountability, political theater without consequence, the machinery adapting to protect power regardless of the outcome. Ulysses S. Grant became president in March 1869 as a war hero and left office in March 1877 as a symbol of corruption and incompetence, though the reality was more complex than either reputation. Grant himself was not personally corrupt in the sense of taking bribes or enriching himself through office. His problem was that he trusted people who betrayed that trust, appointed friends who used their positions for personal gain, and defended them long after evidence of their corruption became overwhelming. The result was an administration riddled with scandals that Grant's personal integrity couldn't contain. The first major scandal was the gold ring conspiracy in 1869. Two financiers, Jay Gould and James Fisk, attempted to corner the gold market by driving up prices. They needed the federal government to stop selling gold reserves, which would counteract their price manipulation. They cultivated Grant's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, who introduced them to Grant and convinced them the president would cooperate. Grant didn't cooperate, and when he learned of the scheme in September 1869, he ordered the Treasury to sell gold, breaking the corner and crashing the market on Black Friday, September 24th. Fortunes were lost. Grant avoided direct implication, but the scandal revealed how easily his inner circle could be manipulated by financiers seeking government favor. The whiskey ring scandal of 1875 was worse, because it directly involved Grant's appointees and personal secretary. The scheme involved distillers and treasury officials across multiple cities conspiring to evade federal whiskey taxes. The distillers would pay bribes to treasury agents, who would then falsify production records, allowing massive tax evasion. The operation ran for years, defrauding the government of millions in revenue. The money was partly used to fund Republican Party campaigns, creating a corruption loop where stolen tax money funded the party that controlled the enforcement mechanisms. Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow launched an investigation in 1875 that exposed the conspiracy. Over 238 indictments were issued. Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted for conspiracy. Grant initially supported the investigation, but turned defensive when Babcock was charged. He gave a deposition defending Babcock's character, which helped secure Babcock's acquittal. The prosecution successfully convicted many participants, but Grant's intervention protected his personal secretary despite substantial evidence of guilt. It demonstrated that Grant's loyalty to friends overrode his commitment to accountability. The Credit Mobilier scandal, though it originated before Grant's presidency, exploded during his first term and implicated members of Congress and his own vice president, Schuyler Colfax. Credit Mobilier was a construction company created by Union Pacific Railroad executives to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The company massively overcharged the railroad for construction costs, effectively allowing the executives to pay themselves inflated fees using federal subsidies. To prevent congressional investigation, Credit Mobilier sold shares to key congressmen at below market rates, essentially bribing them with guaranteed profits. Representative Oakes Ames of Massachusetts distributed the shares. The scandal broke in 1872 during Grant's re-election campaign. Congressional investigations revealed that Vice President Colfax and multiple prominent congressmen had received shares and lied about it. Colfax wasn't renominated for vice president. Several congressmen were censured. The investigations revealed systematic corruption in the railroad subsidies that built the Transcontinental Railroad, but prosecutions were limited. The companies had achieved their goal, the railroad was built, the subsidies were secured, and only a few individuals faced consequences while the underlying system of political corporate collaboration continued. Grant's 2 terms established the template for Gilded Age corruption, rapid economic development enabled by government subsidies, systematic fraud in federal contracting and taxation, political machines funded by illegal money, and selective prosecution that punished mid-level participants while protecting wealthy architects and politically connected defenders. Grant left office in March 1877, with his military reputation intact, but his political reputation damaged. He attempted a 3rd term in 1880, but lost the Republican nomination. He died in 1885, having finished his memoirs while dying of throat cancer. The memoirs were excellent and restored his reputation as a writer and military strategist. The political corruption of his administration remained in the historical record, a demonstration that personal integrity doesn't prevent systemic corruption when the systems themselves are designed to reward it. Rutherford B. Hayes entered the presidency in March 1877 through one of the most corrupt bargains in American history. The Compromise of 1877. The election of 1876 between Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was disputed. Tilden won the popular vote and was one electoral vote short of winning the Electoral College. 20 electoral votes from 4 states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, were disputed, with both parties submitting competing certifications. Congress created an electoral commission to resolve the disputes. The commission had 15 members, 5 senators, 5 representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices, divided along party lines. The commission voted strictly on party lines, awarding all 20 disputed votes to Hayes, giving him a 185 to 184 electoral college victory. Democrats controlled the House and could have blocked the result. They didn't. The compromise reached in late February 1877 gave Republicans the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The deal was finalized in meetings at the Wormley Hotel in Washington, where Republican and Democratic representatives negotiated terms. Hayes would become president. Federal troops would leave the South. Federal support for Republican state governments in Louisiana and South Carolina would end, allowing Democratic Redeemer governments to take power. The federal government would invest in Southern infrastructure. Several Southern Democrats would receive appointments in Hayes's administration. It was all informal, conducted through intermediaries, with no signed agreement. Hayes himself maintained he wasn't directly involved in the negotiations, but his closest advisors were, and Hayes honored the terms immediately upon taking office. By April 1877, the last federal troops withdrew from South Carolina and Louisiana. The Republican state governments collapsed. Democratic governments took power and immediately began dismantling black political participation through violence and fraud that federal authority no longer challenged. The Compromise of 1877 traded black civil rights for Republican retention of the presidency. It was a calculated betrayal dressed as sectional reconciliation. Hayes left office in 1881, having served 1 term as promised. He spent his remaining years on education and prison reform, expressing regret about the abandonment of Reconstruction without acknowledging his role in finalizing it. He died in 1893. The compromise he accepted established Democratic control of the South for the next 80 years and created the Jim Crow system that lasted until the 1960s. 20 disputed electoral votes gave Hayes the presidency. 4 million formerly enslaved people in the South lost federal protection. The machinery of politics adapted. The votes were traded. The presidency was secured. The people who paid the price weren't consulted. The pattern held. The compromise was celebrated as the end of a difficult era. The systematic disenfranchisement and terror that followed wasn't factored into the cost. James Garfield became president in March 1881 and was shot in July, dying in September after 11 weeks of medical incompetence that probably killed him faster than the bullet. His presidency was too brief to generate major scandals, but what defined his brief tenure was patronage. Garfield inherited the spoils system that had been expanding since Andrew Jackson and had become by 1880 an entrenched corruption mechanism. Government jobs were distributed to political supporters regardless of competence. Senators expected to control federal appointments in their states. The president's time was consumed mediating between competing demands for offices. Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau, was a mentally ill office seeker who believed he deserved a consulship and blamed Garfield for not appointing him. Guiteau shot Garfield in a Washington train station on July 2nd, reportedly shouting, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts." Arthur is president now, referring to Vice President Chester Arthur, who represented the Republican Party faction most committed to patronage. The deeper scandal that Garfield never had time to fully address was the Star Route fraud. The Postal Service contracted with private carriers to deliver mail on star routes, rural routes too expensive for the government to operate directly. The contracts were supposed to be awarded through competitive bidding. Instead, postal officials and contractors conspired to rig bids, inflate route costs, and pay bribes. The fraud had been operating for years, costing the Treasury millions annually. Garfield appointed reformers to investigate, but before significant action could be taken, he was shot. The investigation continued under Arthur, leading to multiple indictments, but most defendants were acquitted due to lack of definitive evidence and skilled legal defense. The Star Route scandal exemplified Gilded Age corruption, systematic fraud in government contracting, political protection of those involved, and outcomes where the architects faced few consequences while the system continued largely unchanged. Garfield lingered for 79 days after being shot, during which doctors repeatedly probed the wound with unsterilized instruments, causing infections that medical historians believe were the primary cause of death. Alexander Graham Bell attempted to locate the bullet using a metal detector he had invented, but Garfield's metal bed frame interfered with the device. Garfield died on September 19, 1881. The tragedy accelerated civil service reform. Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, establishing merit-based hiring for some federal positions, though patronage remained widespread for decades. Garfield's assassination by a disappointed office seeker became the symbol of the spoils system's madness. Though the system's deeper corruption, the use of government employment as political reward, creating incompetent administration and systematic fraud, took generations to fully dismantle. Garfield died before accomplishing much. His death accomplished more than his life by making the corruption he inherited briefly intolerable. The reform was partial. The patronage continued in new forms. But the symbol was useful. The machinery adapted. The pattern held. Chester Arthur became president in September 1881, when Garfield died, and managed to surprise everyone by actually pursuing reform despite having been the epitome of machine politics before assuming office. Arthur had been collector of the Port of New York, a position that controlled thousands of jobs and was the crown jewel of Republican patronage in New York State. He'd been appointed by Grant and dismissed by Hayes for refusing to reform the Customs House's patronage system. Arthur represented everything reform-minded citizens hated about Gilded Age politics, a machine operative who distributed jobs based on political loyalty and kickbacks. When he became president, reformers expected the worst. Arthur instead supported the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, which established merit-based competitive examinations for some federal jobs. It was a limited reform. Only about 10% of federal positions initially fell under the merit system, but it was more than reformers expected from Arthur. The reform came partly from genuine conversion and partly from political calculation. Garfield's assassination had made the spoils system politically toxic. Arthur needed to distance himself from it to have any chance at the 1884 nomination. What's less discussed is that Arthur's reform credentials were limited to civil service. His Customs House background remained relevant throughout his presidency. During his time as collector, the New York Customs House was documented to have systematic underassessment of import duties, allowing importers to pay less tax in exchange for bribes to customs officials. Congressional investigations in the 1870s had exposed the corruption, but prosecutions were limited. Arthur claimed he had cleaned up the worst abuses when he ran the operation, but the investigations suggested the corruption was institutional and continued despite surface reforms. As president, Arthur didn't pursue aggressive investigation of customs fraud, possibly because doing so would have implicated his former subordinates and himself. The reform he supported, civil service, didn't touch the corruption he knew best, customs and tariff manipulation. It was selective integrity, addressing the politically necessary issue while avoiding the one that might expose his past. Arthur also oversaw what became known as the Great Barbecue of public lands. Though the practice had been ongoing long before his presidency, the federal government was granting massive land subsidies to railroad companies to encourage westward expansion. The grants were supposed to support railroad construction, In practice, they enriched railroad executives and speculators who acquired land at minimal cost, waited for railroads to increase its value, and sold it at enormous profit. Arthur didn't create this system. It had operated since the 1850s, but his administration continued it without serious reform. The Department of the Interior, under his watch, approved land grants with minimal oversight. Fraud was widespread. Railroad companies claimed subsidies for routes never built or shoddily constructed. The corruption was so normalized that it barely registered as scandal. It was simply how business worked. Arthur left office in March 1885, having served out Garfield's term without seeking election in his own right. The Republican Party didn't want him. He'd lost the machine politicians by supporting civil service reform and failed to win reformers' full trust because his reform was selective. He died in 1886 from kidney disease. His presidency demonstrated that Gilded Age corruption was systemic. Even a reformed machine politician could only address the politically necessary reforms while leaving the deeper structural corruption intact. Grover Cleveland entered the presidency in March 1885 as the first Democrat elected since before the Civil War. His reputation was built on anti-corruption credentials. He'd fought Tammany Hall as mayor of Buffalo and as governor of New York. What the reputation obscured was a personal scandal that would have ended most political careers, but somehow enhanced Cleveland's. During the 1884 campaign, the Buffalo Evening Telegraph published allegations that Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock with Maria Halpin, a widow, in the 1870s. Cleveland acknowledged the possibility. He'd had a relationship with Halpin, though the paternity was uncertain since Halpin had been involved with multiple men. Cleveland had provided financial support for the child, who was placed with an adoptive family. The scandal should have destroyed his campaign. Instead, Cleveland's response was to tell his advisors to tell the truth. His honesty about the relationship, while maintaining respectability on policy issues, convinced enough voters that he was morally acceptable despite the personal failing. What's less discussed is what happened to Maria Halpin. After the child's birth, Cleveland used his political connections to have Halpin committed to a mental institution briefly when she attempted to regain custody of the child. The commitment was involuntary. Halpin later claimed Cleveland had sexually assaulted her, though she made this claim decades later and the historical record is disputed. Cleveland's version was that the relationship was consensual, and that Halpin had been unstable and alcoholic, justifying the institutional commitment. The documentation is incomplete and contested. What's clear is that Cleveland had the power to have a woman institutionalized to resolve a custody dispute, and he used that power. He later provided financial support that ended his direct involvement with the child. The scandal revealed both Cleveland's honesty about sexual relationships and his willingness to use institutional power against women who challenged him. Both things were true. The voters chose to emphasize the honesty. Cleveland's major scandal as president was his handling of the Pullman strike in 1894 during his second term. But his first term established patterns of corporate-friendly governance that made the strike response predictable. Cleveland was a conservative Democrat who opposed labor unions, tariffs that protected American workers, and government intervention in the economy, except when that intervention supported business interests. He vetoed hundreds of private pension bills for Civil War veterans, arguing they were fiscally irresponsible, while supporting gold standard policies that enriched creditors and banking interests. In July 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company near Chicago went on strike over wage cuts and high rents in company housing. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, supported the strike by refusing to handle trains with Pullman cars. The strike paralyzed rail traffic across the Midwest. Cleveland responded by sending federal troops to Chicago in July 1894 over the objections of Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld, who argued the state could handle the situation and that federal intervention was unconstitutional. Cleveland justified the intervention by claiming the strike interfered with mail delivery and interstate commerce. Federal troops broke the strike through violence. Clashes between troops and strikers resulted in property destruction and deaths. Accounts vary, but approximately 30 people died during the strike and its suppression. Eugene Debs was arrested for violating a federal injunction against interfering with mail trains. He was convicted of contempt and sentenced to 6 months in prison. The strike collapsed by mid-July. Cleveland had demonstrated that federal power could be deployed to break labor actions that threatened corporate interests, establishing a precedent that would be used repeatedly over the next decades. Cleveland's defenders argued he was enforcing law and protecting commerce. Critics noted he was much quicker to deploy federal troops against workers than he had been to protect black voters in the South, where violence and fraud had suppressed Republican votes in his 1884 election. The priorities were clear. Property and commerce deserved federal protection. Workers and black citizens did not. Cleveland left office in March 1897 after serving 2 non-consecutive terms, the only president to do so. He died in 1908. His legacy was conservative governance that protected business interests, honest corruption in the sense that he clearly stated his anti-labor and pro-business positions rather than hiding them, and personal controversy he survived through selective honesty. The pattern held. The workers who died in the Pullman strike didn't get justice. Debs went to prison. The Pullman Company continued operating. The machinery adapted. Cleveland's second term from 1893 to 1897 was dominated by the Panic of 1893 and his response to it, which involved making a secret deal with J.P. Morgan that saved the gold standard while enriching Morgan and violating Cleveland's stated principles about government banking relationships. The panic began in May 1893 with a stock market crash triggered by railroad overbuilding, silver inflation fears, and European capital withdrawal. Banks failed. Unemployment spread. By 1894, the Treasury's gold reserves fell below $100 million, threatening the government's ability to maintain the gold standard. Cleveland was committed to gold and terrified of silver inflation. In February 1895, with reserves near $60 million and falling, Cleveland turned to Morgan. The deal was negotiated in secret at the White House. Morgan and a syndicate of bankers would purchase 3.5 million ounces of government bonds using gold, replenishing the Treasury's reserves. In exchange, the syndicate received favorable terms. They could resell the bonds at a profit, effectively guaranteed by the government's promise to maintain the gold standard. The deal worked in the narrow sense. The gold reserves stabilized. But the optics were catastrophic. The Democratic president had made a secret deal with the most powerful banker in America to solve a financial crisis using terms that enriched the bankers. Populists and silver advocates exploded in rage. Cleveland defended the deal as necessary to prevent economic collapse. Critics noted he could have simply issued bonds publicly rather than giving Morgan's syndicate favorable terms. The Morgan deal exemplified Gilded Age corruption's final form, not bribery or fraud, but the fusion of government and corporate power, where both sides benefited from arrangements they presented as serving public interest. Morgan saved the gold standard, which protected banking interests and international creditors. Cleveland preserved the financial system, which protected his reputation and democratic economic policy. The public paid through the profit Morgan's syndicate extracted from reselling the bonds. It was legal. It was corrupt in the sense that it privatized profit from a public problem. Cleveland left office in March 1897 with his party bitterly divided and populist anger at its height. William Jennings Bryan would capture the Democratic nomination in 1896, running against everything Cleveland represented. Cleveland retired to New Jersey and died in 1908, still defending the Morgan deal as economic necessity. The deal stood as precedent. When financial crisis threatened, government would turn to private bankers who would profit from solving problems they had partly caused. The pattern would repeat in 1907, 1929, 1987, 2008, and beyond. The machinery adapted. The profits flowed. The public paid. Cleveland called it sound finance. The populace called it betrayal. Both were right. The contradiction defined the era. Benjamin Harrison served one term between Cleveland's two, from March 1889 to March 1893. His administration was marked by the massive expansion of the pension system he had campaigned on. He'd criticized Cleveland's pension vetoes, but the expansion became its own scandal. Harrison appointed James Corporal Tanner as Commissioner of Pensions in March 1889. Tanner was a Union veteran who had lost both legs in the Civil War and who promised to distribute pensions generously. He famously said he would drive a 6-mule team through the Treasury on behalf of veterans. He did. During his brief 6-month tenure before resigning amid scandal, Tanner approved pension claims at unprecedented rates, often without adequate verification. Fraud became rampant. People who hadn't served claimed disabilities. Doctors certified false conditions. Pension agents received kickbacks for facilitating fraudulent claims. The pension system ballooned from $80 million annually in 1888 to $135 million by 1893. Harrison defended the expansion as honoring veterans, which it partly did. Many legitimate claims were finally approved. But the fraud was systematic and openly acknowledged. A congressional investigation in 1892 documented extensive abuse but resulted in few prosecutions. The political incentive favored fraud. Veterans were a powerful voting bloc. Nobody wanted to be seen as insufficiently generous, even if the generosity funded false claims. Harrison's administration also oversaw tariff manipulation that enriched industries while raising prices for consumers. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised average duties to nearly 50% on many imports, supposedly to protect American industry. The protection primarily benefited manufacturers who could charge higher domestic prices without foreign competition, while consumers paid more for goods. The tariff was written with input from the industries it protected, creating obvious conflicts of interest. Harrison signed it in October 1890, despite knowing it would be politically costly. Republicans lost control of the House in the 1890 midterms, partly due to voter anger over higher prices. Harrison defended the tariff as supporting American jobs, which was true for some workers, but ignored that it was effectively a tax on consumers to benefit specific industries that had lobbied for protection. It was legal corruption, the kind where the process is transparent and the outcome is predetermined by who has influence. Harrison lost re-election in 1892 to Cleveland in a rematch of their 1888 race. He returned to Indiana and practiced law until his death in 1901. His administration exemplified Gilded Age governance, systematic fraud, and federal programs that benefited politically powerful constituencies, tariff policies written by the industries they protected, and selective prosecution that acknowledged corruption without meaningfully addressing it. The machinery continued. The fraud was normalized. The pattern held. Harrison's presidency demonstrated that corruption doesn't require secrecy when the benefits flow to politically organized groups who vote. The veterans got their pensions, legitimate or not. The manufacturers got their tariff protection. The consumers paid higher prices. The Treasury paid inflated costs. The system worked exactly as designed. The question of whether it was just never seriously arose. William McKinley entered the presidency in March 1897, representing the triumph of corporate republicanism over populist revolt, and his administration would perfect the machinery of American empire. McKinley's election was funded by industrialist Mark Hanna, who raised unprecedented campaign money from corporations and banks terrified of William Jennings Bryan's silver platform. Hanna's fundraising created the modern corporate-funded campaign, establishing that presidential elections could be bought if you had enough industrial money behind you. McKinley repaid his backers with the Dingley Tariff of 1897, raising duties even higher than the McKinley Tariff he'd championed as a congressman. The protection enriched manufacturers. Consumers paid more. The system worked. McKinley's defining act was the Spanish-American War of 1898, sold as liberation of Cuba, but functioning as territorial acquisition. The sinking of the US Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 provided the pretext, though the cause of the explosion was never conclusively determined. Yellow journalism from William Randolph Hearst's and Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers inflamed public opinion with exaggerated and sometimes fabricated atrocity stories. McKinley resisted war initially, but surrendered to pressure by April. The war lasted 4 months. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba became independent in name, but under American economic and military control. The Philippines acquisition was the revealing part. McKinley claimed divine guidance told him to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, most of whom were already Catholic. The Philippine-American War that followed from 1899 to 1902 killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, many of them civilians, through combat and war-related disease and famine. American forces used tactics including torture and civilian targeting. The conflict was brutal and is largely absent from popular memory of McKinley's presidency. Congressional investigations and military reports documented atrocities including the water-cure torture technique, concentration camps for civilians, and summary executions. Officers who reported these practices were sometimes reprimanded, but prosecutions were rare and punishment minimal. McKinley defended the war as benevolent assimilation, bringing American civilization to backward peoples. The Filipinos who resisted independence called it conquest. Both sides were right about what was happening. McKinley was assassinated in September 1901 by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. He died 8 days later from gangrene and infection, another president killed partly by medical incompetence. His legacy was American empire dressed as liberation, corporate power funding governance, and atrocities rationalized as civilizing missions. The Philippines remained under American control until 1946. The pattern was set. America would acquire territory through war, call it liberation, suppress resistance brutally, and frame the whole enterprise as benevolent. The machinery had gone imperial. Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency in September 1901 at age 42, the youngest president in history, and spent 8 years cultivating an image as trust-busting reformer while actually consolidating corporate power under regulatory frameworks that served big business. Roosevelt filed 44 antitrust suits, more than any previous president, creating his reputation as the trust buster. What's less discussed is that Roosevelt distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts, with the distinction often depending on whether corporate leaders cooperated with his administration. J.P. Morgan and other major industrialists learned they could avoid prosecution by accepting federal regulation that they helped write. The result was regulatory capture presented as reform. Corporations gained stability and protection from competition while accepting oversight that rarely threatened their fundamental interests. Roosevelt's greatest imperial achievement was acquiring the Panama Canal Zone through methods that ranged from diplomatic pressure to supporting a manufactured revolution. Colombia controlled Panama and rejected Roosevelt's Canal Treaty terms in 1803. Roosevelt encouraged Panamanian separatists, sent warships to prevent Colombian forces from suppressing the rebellion, and recognized Panamanian independence within days of the November 1903 revolt. The new Panamanian government immediately granted the United States the Canal Zone on favorable terms. Roosevelt later boasted, "I took the Canal Zone and let Congress debate," a statement he made in 1911 that he later claimed was misunderstood. The canal was built using Caribbean and African laborers who died by the thousands from disease and accidents. Official counts documented over 5,000 deaths during construction. The actual number was likely higher. The canal opened in 1914. It was an engineering marvel, built through imperial power, thousands of dead workers, and a revolution the United States orchestrated and then recognized. Roosevelt's trust-busting credentials also obscured his willingness to use federal power against labor. During the anthracite coal strike of 1902, Roosevelt intervened by threatening to seize the mines with federal troops, unless owners negotiated with the Union. It looked like pro-labor intervention. The settlement Roosevelt brokered gave miners modest gains, but established federal mediation as alternative to genuine Union power. Roosevelt's progressive reputation rested partly on being slightly less hostile to labor than his predecessors and successors, which set a low bar. He left office in 1909, having declined to run for a third term, and spent years regretting that decision before attempting a comeback in 1912. His presidency established that progressive rhetoric could coexist with imperial policy and corporate-friendly regulation. The image management worked. The canal stood. The machinery adapted. Roosevelt became the face of reform while perfecting techniques of control. William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt in March 1909 and spent 4 years demonstrating that Roosevelt's chosen successor couldn't maintain Roosevelt's political coalition or his image management skills. Taft actually filed 90 antitrust suits, more than Roosevelt, but was perceived as more conservative because he lacked Roosevelt's flair, and because he alienated progressive Republicans. Taft's major scandal was the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, which revealed corruption in conservation policy. Richard Ballinger, Taft's Secretary of the Interior, reopened public lands for private development that Roosevelt had protected. Gifford Pinchot, head of the Forest Service and Roosevelt ally, accused Ballinger of favoring corporate interests and specifically of corruption in Alaska coal land claims. The claims involved Clarence Cunningham, who had filed for Alaska coal lands, through methods that appeared to violate regulations. Ballinger had represented Cunningham as a private attorney before joining Taft's cabinet, creating obvious conflict of interest. Pinchot publicized the allegations. Taft fired Pinchot in January 1910 for insubordination, which looked like covering up corruption. Congressional hearings investigated the affair through spring and summer 1910. The majority report exonerated Ballinger. The minority report condemned him. Ballinger resigned in March 1911 under continuing pressure. The scandal split the Republican Party between conservatives supporting Taft and progressives backing Roosevelt. The investigation revealed that conservation policy was being shaped by corporate interests seeking access to public resources, a pattern that was widespread but rarely prosecuted. Taft also pursued dollar diplomacy, encouraging American banks to invest in Latin America and China as a tool of foreign policy. The policy enriched banks while creating dependencies and resentments. Interventions in Nicaragua and other Central American countries established patterns of American military involvement protecting corporate investments. Taft lost re-election in 1912 when Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate, splitting Republican votes and handing the presidency to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Taft later became Chief Justice, the position he'd always wanted more than the presidency. His single term demonstrated that progressive policy could be implemented by conservatives if the motivation was corporate stability rather than genuine reform, and that image management mattered more than actual trust-busting. The machinery continued. The conservation scandal was forgotten. The dollar diplomacy precedent remained. Taft got his judgeship. The pattern held. Woodrow Wilson entered the presidency in March 1913 as a progressive reformer who would oversee wartime civil liberties suppression that made Adams's Sedition Act look restrained. Wilson's domestic reforms included the Federal Reserve Act, antitrust legislation, and labor protections, genuine progressive achievements that expanded federal regulatory power. Then came World War I. Wilson kept America neutral through his first term, winning re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." By April 1917, he was asking Congress for a declaration of war. The reversal was justified by German submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. But Wilson's transformation from neutrality advocate to war leader required silencing domestic opposition. The Espionage Act of June 1917 and Sedition Act of May 1918 criminalized anti-war speech, criticism of the government, and anything deemed disloyal or obstructive to the war effort. The laws made it illegal to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States. The prosecutions were systematic. Over 2,000 people were prosecuted under these acts during the war. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs received a 10-year sentence for an anti-war speech in June 1918. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction. Film producer Robert Goldstein was sentenced to 10 years for making a film about the American Revolution that portrayed British soldiers negatively. During a war when Britain was an ally, German-language newspapers were shut down. German immigrants faced harassment and violence with government encouragement. The Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI, conducted surveillance of suspected radicals and dissenters. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer organized raids in 1919 and 1920 that arrested thousands of suspected radicals, many of them immigrants who were deported without due process. Wilson approved these actions. The war ended in November 1918. The prosecutions and deportations continued through Wilson's presidency. Wilson's second major cover-up was concealing his stroke in October 1919. Wilson was in Colorado promoting the League of Nations Treaty when he suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired. His wife Edith and physician Carrie Grayson concealed the extent of his disability from the public, Congress, and even the cabinet. For the remaining 17 months of Wilson's presidency, Edith Wilson controlled access to the president and made many decisions herself, effectively functioning as an unelected chief executive. Cabinet meetings were canceled. Advisors communicated with Wilson through written memos that Edith filtered. The vice president and cabinet never invoked any disability procedures because the extent of Wilson's incapacity was hidden. Senator Albert Fall and others who managed to see Wilson reported he was clearly impaired, but the administration denied it. Wilson's disability became an open secret in Washington while remaining officially unacknowledged. The stroke occurred as Wilson was fighting for Senate ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations membership. His inability to negotiate with Senate Republicans contributed to the treaty's defeat. Wilson's stubbornness, possibly exacerbated by his cognitive impairment, prevented compromise that might have secured ratification with reservations. The League failed in the Senate in November 1919 and again in March 1920. Wilson left office in March 1921, physically broken and politically defeated. He died in February 1924. His legacy included progressive domestic reforms, catastrophic civil liberties suppression, and a cover-up that left the presidency effectively vacant for over a year while his wife governed in secret. The Sedition Act was repealed in 1921. The deportations and prosecutions under it were never remedied. Debs was pardoned by Warren Harding in 1921, but not exonerated. The precedent remained. Wartime allowed suppression of dissent that peacetime wouldn't tolerate. The machinery adapted. The closed door hid the incapacity. The pattern held. Warren Harding became president in March 1921, promising a return to normalcy after Wilson's idealistic internationalism and wartime controls. What returned was corruption so blatant it became synonymous with his presidency. Harding wasn't personally venal in the sense of stealing money, but he appointed friends who robbed the government systematically. His cabinet included capable figures like Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover and Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, but also cronies from Ohio who treated government service as opportunity for enrichment. The most infamous was Interior Secretary Albert Fall, who orchestrated the Teapot Dome scandal. Fall leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming and Elk Hills, California, to private oil companies without competitive bidding in exchange for bribes totaling over $400,000, about $6 million in current value. The leases were supposedly justified by national security concerns about naval oil reserves. The actual motivation was Fall's personal debt and the oil company's desire for exclusive access. The scandal emerged after Harding's death, when Senate investigations led by Thomas Walsh of Montana uncovered the payments. Fall had received loans from oil executives Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny that were clearly bribes. Fall became the first cabinet member convicted of crimes committed while in office, sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $100,000 fine in 1929. Sinclair and Doheny were acquitted of bribery charges, despite clear evidence they had made the payments, demonstrating once again that wealthy executives faced fewer consequences than corrupt officials. The oil leases were canceled. The reserves were returned to government control, but the scandal tainted Harding's presidency retroactively and reinforced public cynicism about government corruption. Harding's other scandal was his poker cabinet, the group of friends who met regularly at the White House for drinking and gambling during Prohibition. These gatherings weren't criminal themselves, though serving alcohol violated the law Harding was supposed to enforce. The problem was that the poker sessions included officials who were looting their departments. Attorney General Harry Daugherty was accused of selling pardons, liquor permits, and dismissing prosecutions in exchange for bribes. Veterans Bureau Director Charles Forbes was convicted of fraud for awarding contracts at inflated prices and taking kickbacks. Harding's friends treated federal office as business opportunity. The president knew about some of the corruption. He confronted Forbes about the Veterans Bureau fraud before his death, but took no meaningful action to stop it. Harding died suddenly in August 1923 in San Francisco, officially from a heart attack or stroke. The circumstances fueled conspiracy theories. He died unexpectedly after falling ill during a West Coast speaking tour. His wife refused an autopsy, and she later destroyed many of his papers. Speculation ranged from murder by his wife to suicide over impending scandal revelations. No credible evidence supports these theories. The medical consensus is that Harding died from cardiovascular disease, exacerbated by stress and poor health habits. But the timing was convenient in the sense that it spared him from watching his administration's corruption fully exposed. The scandals broke primarily after his death. Harding was remembered as a failed president whose friends betrayed him, which was partly true but obscured his complicity through inaction. He knew corruption was occurring and chose loyalty to friends over accountability. The poker games continued until he died. The looting continued until exposure. The closed door hid the deals until investigators opened it. The pattern held. Calvin Coolidge succeeded Harding in August 1923 and spent 5 years embodying the principle that saying nothing can be a successful governing strategy when the status quo serves powerful interests. Coolidge's defining characteristic was silence. Silent Cal spoke rarely, governed minimally, and believed the business of America was business. His passive approach suited the 1920s boom perfectly. Coolidge cut taxes for wealthy Americans, reduced federal spending except for business subsidies, and appointed regulators who didn't regulate. The result was the stock market bubble that would burst months after he left office. Coolidge wasn't ignorant of the speculation. Financial experts and some Federal Reserve officials warned about excessive stock market leverage and credit expansion. Coolidge ignored them. His position was that markets would self-correct, and government intervention would make things worse. This wasn't principled non-interference. It was selective inaction that favored corporate interests while ignoring warning signs. Coolidge's Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, reduced taxes on high incomes and capital gains, shifting tax burden to middle-class Americans while enriching the wealthy. Mellon himself benefited enormously from the policies he implemented. It was legal, but corrupt, in the sense that the Treasury Secretary designed tax policy that directly enriched himself and his class. Coolidge appointed business-friendly regulators to agencies meant to oversee corporate behavior. The Federal Trade Commission under Coolidge stopped challenging monopolistic practices. The Interstate Commerce Commission approved railroad mergers that reduced competition. The regulatory agencies became partners with the industries they regulated rather than watchdogs. Coolidge also continued dollar diplomacy in Latin America, sending Marines to Nicaragua in 1926 to protect American business interests and support a government friendly to U.S. corporations. The intervention would last until 1933, long after Coolidge left office. But he established the precedent that American military force would maintain favorable investment climates. Coolidge declined to run in 1928, supposedly because he was tired and mourning his son's death in 1924. He left office in March 1929. The stock market crashed in October. The Great Depression followed. Coolidge spent his remaining years defending his policies and denying that they contributed to the crash. He died in January 1933, just before Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration would decisively repudiate Coolidge's governing philosophy. Coolidge's silence wasn't absence of policy. It was policy itself, deliberate inaction that allowed wealth concentration, speculation, and corporate power to expand unchecked. The closed door wasn't hiding scandal. It was hiding complicity. Coolidge knew the system was unstable. He chose not to act because action would have constrained the interests he served. The tax cuts enriched Mellon and his class. The deregulation enabled corporate consolidation. The military interventions protected investments. The stock bubble inflated until it burst. Coolidge was silent about all of it, which was precisely the point. The machinery required no oversight. The pattern held. The silence spoke volumes. Herbert Hoover entered the presidency in March 1929, believing in voluntary cooperation between business and government, and left office in March 1933 with that faith shattered by economic catastrophe he refused to adequately address. The stock market crashed in October 1929, 7 months into Hoover's presidency. His response was to encourage business leaders to maintain wages and investment while opposing direct federal relief to unemployed Americans. Hoover believed federal aid would create dependency and undermine character. He supported loans to businesses and banks through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, established in 1932, which provided billions in federal loans to failing institutions. The logic was that helping businesses would eventually help workers through restored employment. It was trickle-down economics during a depression. It didn't work. By 1932, unemployment reached 25%. Banks failed by the thousands. Hoover's principled opposition to direct relief looked like callous indifference. The Bonus Army incident in July 1932 destroyed what remained of Hoover's reputation. World War I veterans, promised bonuses payable in 1945, marched on Washington demanding early payment during the economic crisis. About 17,000 veterans and their families camped in the Capitol through spring and summer 1932. Congress considered a bill for immediate payment. It failed in the Senate in June. Most veterans left. About 2,000 remained in camps. Hoover ordered their removal. On July 28th, General Douglas MacArthur led Army troops with tanks and tear gas to clear the camps. MacArthur exceeded his orders, not just removing veterans from government property, but burning their camps and driving them across the Potomac. 2 veterans were killed. An infant died from tear gas exposure. The images of the Army attacking veterans during the Depression became defining symbols of Hoover's presidency. Hoover claimed he hadn't ordered the violence and that MacArthur had acted excessively. But Hoover defended the action publicly and never reprimanded MacArthur. The message was clear. Federal power would be used to remove desperate citizens, but not to feed them. Hoover supported billions for banks, but opposed millions for the unemployed. The contradiction was politically fatal and morally indefensible. Hoover lost the 1932 election in a landslide to Franklin Roosevelt. He lived until 1964, spending decades defending his presidency and criticizing Roosevelt's New Deal, as socialism. The bonus army veterans eventually received their payments in 1936 under Roosevelt. The camps Hoover ordered burned became symbols of governmental cruelty during crisis. The machinery had failed to adapt. The Depression continued. Hoover's principles remained intact while millions suffered. The pattern broke. The voters responded. The system changed because inaction finally had consequences. Franklin Roosevelt entered the presidency in March 1933 during the Depression's worst moments, and spent 12 years expanding federal power in ways that saved capitalism while establishing precedents for executive authority that future presidents would abuse. Roosevelt's New Deal programs created jobs, stabilized banking, established Social Security, and empowered labor unions. They were revolutionary in American context and genuinely helped millions. They were also incomplete. Agricultural policies displaced sharecroppers. Many programs excluded domestic and agricultural workers, who were disproportionately Black and Latino, and relief was often administered by local officials who maintained racial hierarchies. Roosevelt's progressivism coexisted with political calculation that avoided confronting Southern Democrats on race. Roosevelt's darker legacy emerged during World War II. In February 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing military commanders to exclude any persons from designated areas. The order enabled the forced removal and incarceration of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, from the West Coast into concentration camps. The decision was justified by military necessity and fear of sabotage. No evidence of Japanese American disloyalty existed. The decision was driven by racism and political pressure. Japanese Americans lost homes, businesses, and freedom. They were held in camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers in desert locations, until 1945. No Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during the war. The internment was acknowledged as injustice decades later. Congress apologized in 1988 and provided minimal reparations. Roosevelt never expressed regret. Roosevelt's other controversial decision was attempting to pack the Supreme Court in 1937. After the court struck down several New Deal programs, Roosevelt proposed adding justices for every current justice over 70, which would have allowed him to appoint 6 new justices immediately. He claimed it would reduce the court's workload. Everyone understood it was court packing to ensure favorable rulings. The proposal failed even with Democratic congressional majorities. It was executive overreach disguised as reform. Roosevelt's willingness to manipulate constitutional structures when they opposed him revealed how progressive means could serve authoritarian ends when the president believed his goals justified the methods. The court started upholding New Deal legislation without the new justices, making the attempt unnecessary in hindsight. But the attempt demonstrated Roosevelt's approach: expand executive power, overcome institutional resistance, achieve policy goals regardless of constitutional norms. Roosevelt died in April 1940, 5 months into his 4th term, having fundamentally transformed American governance. The New Deal established that federal government would regulate economy and provide social welfare. World War II established America as global superpower. Roosevelt's methods, executive orders bypassing Congress, agencies operating with minimal oversight, wartime civil liberties violations, concentration camps for American citizens, established precedents that later presidents would cite when expanding their own authority. The internment camp stood as a reminder that progressive presidents could commit constitutional atrocities when politically convenient. The pattern evolved. Executive power expanded. The justification was crisis. The crisis never fully ended. Harry Truman assumed the presidency in April 1945 when Roosevelt died and immediately faced decisions about ending World War II that remain morally contested. Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. The bombings killed over 200,000 people, mostly civilians, immediately or from radiation effects. Truman's justification was that invasion of Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Critics argue Japan was already defeated, that demonstrating the bomb on an unpopulated area would have achieved surrender, and that the decision to use atomic weapons on cities was unnecessary and constituted war crimes. The historical debate continues. What's documented is that Truman made the decision with minimal consultation, that alternatives existed, and that the human cost was catastrophic. Truman's post-war domestic policy included aggressive anti-communist measures that destroyed lives through guilt by association. His loyalty program, established by Executive Order 9835 in March 1947, required federal employees to undergo loyalty investigations. Membership in organizations deemed subversive, attendance at meetings, or association with suspected communists could result in dismissal. Over 5 million federal employees were investigated. Thousands were fired or resigned under pressure. The standards for disloyalty were vague, and the process lacked due process. The program fueled McCarthyism by legitimizing the premise that communist infiltration threatened American government. Truman later claimed he regretted the program's excesses, but he created the framework that McCarthy exploited. Truman also continued Roosevelt's pattern of bypassing Congress through executive authority. He seized steel mills in 1952 during the Korean War to prevent a strike, claiming presidential power to maintain production during wartime. The Supreme Court ruled the seizure unconstitutional in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer, one of the few times the court checked presidential war powers. Truman left office in January 1953 with his reputation mixed, credited with containing Soviet expansion through Marshall Plan and NATO, condemned for the loyalty program's destruction of careers and the atomic bomb decision's moral weight. The bombs established America's willingness to use ultimate weapons against civilian populations. The loyalty program established that constitutional rights could be suspended based on political beliefs. Both precedents would haunt future generations. The machinery had acquired nuclear weapons and domestic surveillance apparatus. The pattern continued. The justification remained crisis. The crisis was now permanent. Dwight Eisenhower entered the presidency in January 1953 as a war hero promising peace and prosperity, while secretly building a covert action apparatus that would destabilize governments worldwide. Eisenhower's public image was grandfatherly competence. His actual foreign policy was CIA-orchestrated coups, disguised as organic revolutions. In August 1953, the CIA engineered the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry, threatening British and American petroleum interests. Operation Ajax used bribes, propaganda, and orchestrated protests to create chaos that justified military intervention. The Shah was restored to power. British and American oil companies regained control of Iranian oil. The coup was kept secret from the American public until CIA documents were declassified decades later. Eisenhower approved the operation. The justification was preventing Soviet influence. The actual motivation was protecting corporate oil interests. In June 1954, the CIA orchestrated a similar coup in Guatemala, overthrowing democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz, whose land reforms threatened United Fruit Company holdings. Operation PB Success used propaganda, paramilitary forces trained in neighboring countries, and psychological warfare to convince Guatemalan military officers to remove Arbenz. The coup installed a military dictatorship that killed thousands of political opponents over the following decades. Eisenhower approved the operation. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, his brother, had personal and financial connections to United Fruit. The official justification was fighting communism. The documented reality was protecting American corporate interests through regime change. These operations established template, The CIA would overthrow governments threatening American business interests, install friendly dictatorships, and classify the operations so American citizens never knew their government was destroying democracies abroad. Eisenhower's farewell address in January 1961 warned about the military-industrial complex acquiring unwarranted influence over American policy. It was treated as prescient wisdom. It was actually confession. Eisenhower had presided over 8 years of military budget expansion, covert operations, and defense contractor enrichment. His warning came after he'd fed the system he now cautioned against. The military-industrial complex existed because presidents like Eisenhower built it while claiming to restrain it. The speech was remarkable for its honesty about the problem. What it obscured was Eisenhower's role in creating and empowering that problem. He left office having overthrown multiple governments, established permanent covert action capability, and expanded defense spending massively. The warning about military-industrial influence came from the president who had just spent 8 years strengthening exactly that influence. John Kennedy entered the presidency in January 1961, representing generational change and vigor, and spent 1,000 days demonstrating that charisma and incompetence could coexist in one administration. Kennedy's defining early failure was the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The plan, inherited from Eisenhower but approved and executed by Kennedy, sent Cuban exiles trained by the CIA to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. The operation was catastrophic. The invasion force was defeated within 3 days. Over 100 invaders were killed and more than 1,000 captured. Kennedy publicly took responsibility while privately blaming the CIA and military advisors. The failure humiliated America internationally and hardened Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union. Kennedy had approved an invasion plan he barely understood, trusting advisors whose confidence exceeded their competence. Kennedy's private life was equally reckless. He conducted multiple affairs while president, including with women who had connections to organized crime figures. Judith Campbell Exner had relationships with Kennedy and with Sam Giancana, a Chicago mob boss. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover documented these connections and used them for leverage over Kennedy. Hoover maintained files on Kennedy's affairs and made sure the president knew he possessed that information. It was blackmail disguised as security briefings. Kennedy continued the affairs despite knowing Hoover was documenting them. The recklessness extended to national security. Kennedy's relationship with Exner created vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by organized crime or foreign intelligence. The relationships remained secret during his presidency and were only fully documented decades later. Kennedy also escalated American involvement in Vietnam, increasing military advisors from hundreds to over 16,000 by 1963. The escalation was gradual, each step justified as necessary to prevent communist expansion, each step making withdrawal more difficult. Kennedy approved support for the coup that killed South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem in November 1963, removing an ally who had become inconvenient. The coup created instability that required further American involvement to manage. Whether Kennedy would have withdrawn from Vietnam had he lived remains historically debated. What's documented is that he expanded American military presence significantly and approved the coup that destabilized the government America was defending. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. His brief presidency left crises for his successor and a mythology that obscured the reality. Vigorous incompetence, personal recklessness, and escalating commitments to unwinnable conflicts. Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency in November 1963 and spent 5 years achieving monumental domestic reforms while destroying his presidency through a war built on lies. Johnson's domestic legacy included the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, and War on Poverty programs that genuinely expanded opportunity and reduced poverty. These were transformative achievements that Johnson pursued with strategic brilliance and moral conviction. Then there was Vietnam. In August 1964, Johnson claimed North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin and international waters. The claim was that there were 2 attacks on August 2nd and August 4th. Johnson used the alleged attacks to obtain congressional authorization for expanded military action. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed with near unanimity, giving Johnson authority to use military force without declaring war. The problem was that the August 4th attack almost certainly never happened. The Navy officers involved reported uncertain radar contacts in bad weather and explicitly stated they had no confirmation of actual attack. Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara presented the incident to Congress as confirmed attack requiring response. Declassified documents and NSA histories later confirmed the August 4th attack was likely false radar contacts misinterpreted as hostile action. Johnson and McNamara knew the evidence was questionable when they sought congressional authorization. They presented it as certainty. The resolution gave Johnson authority to escalate American involvement from 16,000 advisors to over 500,000 troops by 1968. The war would kill over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese before ending in defeat. Johnson also expanded domestic surveillance dramatically. The FBI's QuintelPro operations targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political dissidents through illegal surveillance, harassment, and disruption. The CIA's Operation Chaos violated its charter by spying on American citizens domestically. Johnson approved these programs as necessary to counter foreign influence on domestic protests. The actual effect was government surveillance and harassment of Americans exercising constitutional rights. Johnson left office in January 1969, having declined to run for re-election after losing public support over Vietnam. His domestic achievements were genuine. His foreign policy was catastrophic. The lie that started the escalation was documented. The casualties were real. The pattern held. Presidents would lie about foreign threats to justify wars that couldn't be won. And the machinery would adapt to make the lies officially respectable, until declassification revealed the truth decades later. Richard Nixon entered the presidency in January 1969 promising law and order while planning crimes that would force his resignation, but Watergate was the scandal everyone knows. His lesser-known crimes were arguably worse. Before winning the 1968 election, Nixon's campaign secretly undermined President Johnson's Vietnam peace negotiations. The Chennault affair involved Anna Chennault, a Republican operative, conveying messages to South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, encouraging him to boycott the Paris peace talks until after the election, promising better terms under Nixon. Johnson had FBI intercepts proving the contact. He called it treason, but didn't go public, fearing it would expose surveillance methods. Nixon won narrowly. The war continued 4 more years, killing thousands more Americans and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese. Nixon had sabotaged peace negotiations for electoral advantage. The evidence existed but remained classified for decades. Once in office, Nixon approved the Houston Plan in July 1970, a domestic intelligence program authorizing illegal surveillance, mail opening, burglary, and infiltration of anti-war groups. The plan was so extreme that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover objected, not on constitutional grounds, but because it threatened FBI bureaucratic control. The plan was officially rescinded, but many activities continued through other programs. Nixon's approach to dissent was criminalization and surveillance. The enemies list documented White House memos, targeted journalists, politicians, and activists for ears audits and other harassment. Watergate, the June 1972 break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters, and subsequent cover-up, was the scandal that finally forced accountability. Nixon resigned in August 1974, facing certain impeachment. But Watergate was amateur burglary compared to sabotaging peace negotiations and establishing domestic surveillance apparatus targeting political opponents. Gerald Ford assumed the presidency in August 1974 and immediately faced the Nixon pardon decision. In September 1974, Ford granted Nixon full pardon for any crimes committed during his presidency. Ford claimed it was necessary for national healing. The timing and totality of the pardon fueled speculation about a deal. Ford becomes president. Nixon avoids prosecution. Both men denied any agreement. The circumstantial evidence was suspicious. Ford had been appointed vice president by Nixon after Spiro Agnew resigned over corruption charges. Nixon then resigned, making Ford president without ever winning a national election. Ford then immediately pardoned the man who appointed him. Whether explicit deal existed or not, the effect was the same. Nixon avoided accountability. Ford's explanation was that prolonged prosecution would prevent the nation from moving forward. Critics argued it established that presidents were above the law. Ford also protected CIA domestic spying operations. The Church Committee investigations in 1975 revealed decades of illegal CIA domestic surveillance, FBI COINTELPRO operations, and other intelligence agency abuses. Ford appointed the Rockefeller Commission to investigate, which produced a limited report acknowledging some abuses while protecting intelligence community institutional interests. Ford opposed more aggressive congressional investigations and fought to keep operations classified. His position was that exposing intelligence methods would damage national security. The effect was limiting accountability for constitutional violations. Ford lost the 1976 election partly due to the Nixon pardon. He spent remaining years defending it as necessary. The pardon established precedent: resign before impeachment, accept pardon, avoid prosecution. The resignation letter as immunity. The pattern held. Jimmy Carter entered the presidency in January 1977, promising honesty after Nixon and Ford. His brother Billy became a scandal involving Libya. Billy Carter registered as foreign agent for Libya in 1979 after receiving $220,000 in loans from the Libyan government while his brother was president. The Justice Department investigated whether Billy had illegally influenced U.S. policy toward Libya. A Senate subcommittee investigated in 1980. The inquiry found no evidence that Jimmy Carter's policies were influenced by the payments, but the appearance was damaging. Billy Carter was a problem throughout the presidency, a heavy drinker who made embarrassing public statements and clearly traded on his brother's position. The Libyan connection during the Iran hostage crisis made it worse. The October surprise allegations claimed that Carter's loss in 1980 resulted from Republican interference in hostage negotiations. The theory was that Reagan campaign officials secretly negotiated with Iran to delay releasing American hostages held since November 1979 until after the election, denying Carter an pre-election breakthrough that might have saved his presidency. The hostages were released minutes after Reagan's inauguration in January 1981. Congressional investigations in the early 1990s found no credible evidence of such deal, though some participants continued claiming it occurred. The allegations remained unproven conspiracy theory. What was documented was Carter's failure to resolve the crisis, the disastrous rescue attempt in April 1980 that killed 8 servicemen, and his electoral defeat. Carter left office in January 1981, having achieved the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, but losing to Reagan in a landslide. His post-presidency humanitarian work restored his reputation. His presidency demonstrated that honest incompetence still failed. The brothers' scandal was real. The October surprise remained alleged. The pattern was accountability theater, investigation without resolution. Ronald Reagan entered the presidency in January 1981, promising to restore American strength, and spent 8 years demonstrating that popular presidents could survive scandals that would have destroyed less charismatic leaders. Iran-Contra was constitutional crisis disguised as foreign policy. Starting in 1985, senior Reagan administration officials secretly sold weapons to Iran, despite an arms embargo in Iran holding American hostages, and used proceeds to fund Nicaraguan Contra rebels despite congressional prohibition on such funding. The Boland Amendment had explicitly banned military aid to the Contras. Reagan's team ignored it. National Security Advisor John Poindexter and NSC staffer Oliver North orchestrated the scheme. When exposed in November 1986, Reagan claimed ignorance. Investigations revealed extensive documentation of the operation. 14 officials were indicted. 11 were convicted, though most convictions were overturned on technicalities or pardoned by George H.W. Bush. Reagan's other major scandal was concealing his declining mental capacity. By his second term, Reagan showed signs of cognitive impairment that would later be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. His performance in the 1984 debates showed confusion and difficulty tracking questions. Staff and family concealed the extent of his decline. Reagan left office in January 1989. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1994. Medical experts have debated whether early symptoms affected his second-term decision-making. The concealment pattern from Wilson repeated. Family and staff hiding presidential disability to maintain power. Reagan's popularity survived Iran-Contra and remained intact even as evidence of criminality emerged. It demonstrated that likability could trump accountability. George H.W. Bush entered the presidency in January 1989, having been Reagan's vice president and CIA director, positions that gave him intimate knowledge of operations he later claimed not to remember. Bush's role in Iran-Contra remained murky. He claimed to be out of the loop on the operation. Evidence suggested otherwise. Bush pardoned 6 Iran-Contra defendants in December 1992, including Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, whose trial might have revealed Bush's involvement. The pardons effectively ended investigations that could have exposed Bush's knowledge. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh stated the pardons demonstrated Bush's misconduct in protecting himself. Bush's major deception was the Gulf War's justification. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Bush built International Coalition for Operation Desert Storm, launched in January 1991. The war was sold partly on testimony by Naira, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who claimed Iraqi soldiers removed babies from incubators in Kuwait hospitals, leaving them to die. Her testimony before a congressional caucus was emotionally powerful and widely cited. After the war, it emerged that Naira was the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S., and that her testimony was part of a PR campaign organized by Hill & Knowlton public relations firm, funded by Kuwait. Whether the incubator story was true remains disputed. The testimony was clearly orchestrated propaganda. Bush left office in January 1993, having won the war but lost re-election. The pardons protected his secrets. The machinery adapted. George W. Bush entered the presidency in January 2001 after a Supreme Court decision that stopped Florida's recount, and would spend 8 years demonstrating that catastrophic failures could occur without meaningful accountability. The September 11th attacks in 2001 enabled the Iraq War, launched in March 2003, on claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and had connections to al-Qaeda. Both claims were false. The intelligence was manipulated to support predetermined policy. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented fabricated evidence to the United Nations in February 2003. No WMDs were found. No meaningful al-Qaeda connection existed before the invasion. The war killed over 4,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis before ending without victory. Bush administration officials who promoted the false intelligence faced no prosecution. The torture memos revealed that Bush authorized interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, stress positions, and sleep deprivation that violated international law. The legal justifications were written by Justice Department lawyers, who redefined torture to permit these techniques. Abu Ghraib prison photos showing American soldiers abusing Iraqi detainees emerged in 2004. Low-ranking soldiers were prosecuted. Senior officials who authorized the policies faced no accountability. Bush admitted in his memoir that he authorized waterboarding. He called it necessary. International law called it torture. The contradiction was acknowledged but never resolved. Bush left office in January 2009 as the financial crisis he'd ignored destroyed the economy. The deregulation Clinton started and Bush continued enabled the subprime mortgage collapse. Banks were bailed out. Homeowners foreclosed. The pattern held. Catastrophic policy failures, documented lies, no accountability for senior officials who made the decisions. Barack Obama entered the presidency in January 2009 promising change and spent 8 years demonstrating that progressive rhetoric could coexist with expanding executive power and protecting predecessors from accountability. Obama declined to prosecute Bush administration officials for torture or the Iraq War lies, arguing the nation needed to look forward, not backward. The decision meant that documented war crimes and intelligence manipulation resulted in no accountability. Obama instead expanded the drone program dramatically. Strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere killed thousands, including American citizens, without trial. Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen, was killed by drone strike in Yemen in 2011. His 16-year-old son, also American, was killed in a separate strike. The administration claimed authority to kill American citizens abroad without judicial process, based on secret legal memos. The kill list was classified. The standards for targeting were classified. The accountability was non-existent. Obama also prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. Chelsea Manning received 35 years for leaking classified documents to WikiLeaks that revealed war crimes and diplomatic misconduct. Edward Snowden fled to Russia after revealing NSA mass surveillance programs that collected phone records and internet communications of millions of Americans without warrants. The surveillance programs Obama expanded violated the Fourth Amendment. They were exposed by whistleblowers Obama prosecuted. The administration's position was that revealing classified programs, even illegal ones, was crime deserving severe punishment. Obama left office in January 2017 with his progressive reputation largely intact despite expanding executive power, protecting torturers from prosecution, killing American citizens without trial, and prosecuting whistleblowers who exposed unconstitutional surveillance. The change was continuity. The accountability remained absent. Donald Trump entered the presidency in January 2017 and spent 4 years treating constitutional norms as obstacles rather than constraints. The Emoluments Clause prohibits presidents from receiving payments from foreign governments. Trump continued operating his international hotel and resort business while president. Foreign governments and officials booked rooms and held events at Trump properties, funneling money to the president. Congressional Democrats sued. The courts moved slowly. Trump left office before definitive ruling. The first major scandal was pressuring Ukraine to investigate political rival Joe Biden. In July 2019, Trump withheld military aid Congress had appropriated for Ukraine while asking Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to announce investigations of Biden and his son. The phone call was documented. A whistleblower reported it. Trump was impeached in December 2019. The Senate acquitted him in February 2020 on party line vote. Trump's second impeachment came after the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. Trump spent months claiming the 2020 election was stolen despite no evidence. 60 court cases challenging results were dismissed. His own Justice Department found no fraud. Trump continued claiming fraud. On January 6th, he told supporters to march to the Capitol. They attacked the building, disrupting the Electoral College certification. 5 people died. Trump was impeached a second time in January 2021. The Senate again acquitted him after he left office, with most Republicans arguing impeachment of former president was unconstitutional. Trump left office in January 2021, having refused to accept election results and having incited attack on Congress. He faced no criminal accountability during his presidency. The pattern completed: constitutional violations, impeachment, acquittal, no consequences. The machinery had fully adapted. Accountability was now entirely partisan. Joe Biden entered the presidency in January 2021 and inherited multiple crises. The classified document scandal emerged in November 2022, when documents from his vice presidency were discovered at his private office and home. A special counsel investigation began in January 2023. Biden cooperated with investigators, unlike Trump, who refused to return documents and obstructed investigation. The legal cases diverged. Biden's conduct appeared less willful. The political damage was similar. Both parties' leaders mishandled classified information. The Afghanistan withdrawal in August 2021 was chaotic. The evacuation was rushed. The Taliban took control quickly. 13 American service members were killed in suicide bombing at Kabul airport. Thousands of Afghan allies were left behind. The withdrawal ended America's longest war, but the execution was catastrophic. Questions about Biden's age and cognitive capacity intensified through his presidency. At 81 during the 2024 campaign, Biden showed signs of decline in public appearances. The pattern from Wilson and Reagan repeated. Questions about presidential capacity that family and staff deflected. The difference was transparency. Biden's struggles were televised and documented in real time. The machinery had evolved. What once could be hidden now played out publicly. But accountability remained absent. Presidents could be old, confused, or declining, and the system had no mechanism for addressing it beyond elections. The pattern held across 46 presidencies. Promises made publicly, calculations made privately, scandals exposed eventually, accountability deferred indefinitely. The presidential seal remained unchanged. The office endured. If you made it through 45 presidents' worth of documented scandals, backroom deals, and normalized corruption, you've earned your rest. The marble monuments downtown don't mention the whiskey operations, the manufactured wars, the torture memos, or the classified documents in private offices. The history textbooks smooth over the rough edges. But the congressional records remain. The investigative journalism persists. The declassified files eventually emerge. Every presidency contains the same gap: the image we're sold versus the machinery that actually operates. From Washington's slave-hunting advertisements to Biden's chaotic withdrawal, from Jefferson's constitutional gymnastics to Trump's emoluments violations, the pattern holds. Power concentrates. Accountability disperses. The scandals change. The structure continues. Thank you for staying with this late into the night. If you want more hidden political history like this, the stories they don't teach, the scandals they'd rather you forget, the machinery they hope you never notice, there are plenty more nights ahead. Next or topic: the Supreme Court justices who took bribes, congressional insider trading, a 200-year history, or the Federal Reserve's secret bailouts. Until then, sleep well. The office endures. The machinery hums. The deals continue in smoke-filled rooms you'll never see, but at least now you know they're there. The presidential seal sits unchanged on the resolute desk, same symbol that watched Washington count his whiskey profits and Biden search for his documents. 46 presidents. 46 sets of public promises and private calculations. The pattern is clear. The machinery is visible. The contradiction is permanent. Rest easy. The system works exactly as designed.